Good morning. This is Hammersmith Chess Club, the weekly endgame workshop in 5 minutes or so. This video is the summary of the second of in total 4 sessions we had in April and May 2020 on a specific type of endgames, of Rook endgames with one pawn. This video looks at defensive methods in scenarios where the defending king cannot reach the promotion square of the pawn. That was the subject of the first session. The defending methods vary depending on one of 3 reasons why the defending king is cut off. This first position shows the first scenario, where the defending king is blocked by the attacking king, which is on or close to the promotion square of its own pawn. In this case, the long side method is the only one available. For that, the defending king has to be on the short side. The defending rook checks on the long side. In order to be successful, the distance between the rook and the king and pawn has to be at least 3 files. Similar principle we have seen already for other methods. The second position shows a more difficult situation where the attacking rook can be blocked, where the attacking rook can block the checks on the long side. The defender has to prevent white's king and rook reaching the 8th rank and the pawn advancing to the 7th rank. And the defender also has to avoid to reduce the checking distance to below 3 files. So in certain situations, and we see that in the continuation, a king's waiting move is required. Here. With the next position, we come to the second scenario. That is the scenario where the defending king is cut off from the pawn along a file. The defense method is frontal attack. It is important that the pawn has not passed yet the middle of the board, because then the required minimum distance which the defending rook needs for the frontal attack is 3 rows. If it would have been on the 5th rank, there would be only 2 rows available. The defending rook waits on the 8th rank in front of the pawn. That is important to prevent it to advance. And as soon as the king approaches, then frontal checks are given. The defending king is ideally placed on the 6th rank, and we see now why. Because when the attacking rook protects the pawn in order for the king to proceed, then the defending king can attack the rook and white cannot advance. The 4th position, or the second example of the cutoff by file scenario, is where the defending king is cut off by 2 files. In this case, it is even more important that the king is able to attack the opponent's rook. The opponent's rook to defend the pawn on the 4th rank. So in this case, with the rook already on the file of the pawn, it is important to locate the king to prevent the attacking rook to defend the pawn. And frontal checks without the defense of the rook. The third scenario is the most difficult to defend against, and that is the cutoff of the king along a rank or along ranks. So here the king is cut off on the 4th rank, cannot go back to the 5th rank. One method alone does not work in this scenario. It depends very much on the specific circumstances what needs to be done. So there are a few examples I would like to present. Here we see the long side attack by the rook. Obviously, that works only when the defending king is on the short side. And again here, the minimum distance has to be 3 files. In the next example, the pawn is still on the 3rd rank. Here, the attacking king itself can be cut off behind the 4th rank. And once the pawn advances far enough, so here's the cutoff of the king. Once the pawn advances far enough, then it is impossible for the attacker to defend the pawn against rook and king, because his own king will be too far away. The third example of the cutoff by ranks shows cutoff by 1 rank with a pawn on the 4th rank, the more typical case. The defender needs to prevent the king to approach using the frontal method with the rook placed on the file adjacent to the pawn. That is important. The king should not be allowed to proceed, because if the king proceeds, for example, here is allowed to proceed, then the own rook could build a bridge between black rook and king. So here, the defending rook has to be placed to the file adjacent to the pawn to prevent building the bridge by white's rook b6. And it should stay on that file. Once the pawn advances, then the king comes close. There is no cutoff by files anymore. And by here, the pawn cannot be defended. The final example compares the defendability of cutoffs by ranks and by files. The defender is advised to avoid cutoff by ranks, because that's more difficult. And this could come after, for example, king e4. Rook has to go away, and now it's a cutoff by rank, and the pawn can advance. And now the next move, king will go, the white will move the king to b3, will move the rook to a5, or the king to a4, and with the help of king and rook, the b pawn will advance and promote. Similarly, rook b8 to go against the pawn would be a mistake, because now it would be cut off by ranks, and now already the attacking rook is protecting the king on the a file to go to the a file, and the pawn can advance unhindered. So the only way is to prevent cutoff by ranks and to go into a cutoff by files. If the pawn advances, will be approached. Now the king is back to the ideal position, and we have seen this scenario. This is a cutoff by files, 2 files, but since the pawn is already in front of the rook is already in front of the pawn, this is a clear drawn situation. To summarize the 3 defensive scenarios, if the attacking king blocks the defending king from approaching, the long side method works. If the defending king is cut off by files, that was the starting position, the frontal attack works. Frontal attack against the pawn. And it's much more difficult in case of cutoff by ranks. Different methods have to be evaluated depending on circumstances. And in principle, it is preferable to have a cutoff by files and not by ranks. So This concludes the defensive methods, and next week we will look at the winning methods of the endgame, Rook plus pawn versus Rook. Have a good success.